Hello, class. Welcome back to Introduction to Public Health. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person this particular week. I'm at a conference in Sydney, Australia, learning all about the prevention and control of HPV-related cancers, an infectious disease that leads to the development of different types of cancer. Anyway, back to today's topic. So today we're going to talk about non-communicable diseases. Now, when you're thinking of, what's the difference between a communicable and a non-communicable disease? Well, think about that verb to communicate, right? Generally, yeah, you can communicate with yourself, but you tend to communicate with other people or things, right? Well, when we're talking about communicable diseases, we tend to think of diseases that are spread between person to person or animal to person or environmental infectious agent to person, right? And we're thinking of also those routes of exposure, how we've, come in contact with infectious agents. When we're thinking of non-communicable diseases, we're thinking about more often these lifestyle diseases that are linked back to some of our behaviors, such as eating and nutrition and smoking and overconsumption of alcohol. And we're also thinking of some of these chronic mental health conditions. So if you're looking at this graph and you're kind of scratching your head and thinking, why did Dr. Koskinen include this? Well, this particular picture in the slides, it's really to kind of show that over the years, from primate to developed two-legged man, we've undergone some physical changes, but we've also undergone some different behavioral changes in terms of what we eat and also what leads to death and disability. So just kind of think about also the history of what used to cause death in the United States more often, or there was a larger majority of death that were attributed to infectious diseases. Now we're shifting, or we've been shifting, with a more Western diet, with lower levels of physical activity, to more often being affected by chronic diseases and non-communicable diseases. So I want you to kind of think about that as to how did that happen? How did we get to where we are now? So if we're looking at data from 2015 that was collected and analyzed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, we find that the leading causes of death in the United States are attributed to chronic diseases. We've talked about it before. Heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States, followed by cancer. Now, important to note is that sometimes cancer is caused by more lifestyle behavioral issues or lifestyle behaviors. And sometimes it is impacted by infectious agents, whether it's a bacteria that leads to stomach cancer, or my favorite all-time topic, HPV, a sexually transmitted infection that can lead to the development of a handful of cancers, right? But when we're thinking about cancer in general, we're thinking about a cell or group of cells that for some reason did not stop multiplying. And we don't always know why or what caused that. Sometimes it was an infectious agent, but sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it's due to a genetic malformation or some type of chronic behavioral issue that led to increased risk for that change in cell that could not stop multiplying, that led to that development of cancer, right? Anyway, if we look at what are those leading causes of death in the United States, we'll see that, again, they are attributed to chronic diseases. Also, if you look at the top 10 causes of health globally, we find that they're also attributed to communicable diseases. Now, this data was published in 2018. The report was published in 2018 by the World Health Organization. The data was collected and published back in 2016. So back in 2016, which not much has changed since that time, we found that, again, globally, similar to the US, there are higher rates of death that are attributed to non-communicable diseases as opposed to infectious disease. Then we've got things such as unintentional injuries or road injuries, and those are really in a category of their own. So why are chronic diseases so harmful? if you could just think of some examples of chronic disease other than heart disease, other than cancer, you could think about type 2 diabetes and stroke, right? Why are they so incredibly harmful? And sometimes if they're manageable, then why do they have to be such a big deal? Well, first of all, they're extremely prevalent. Of all individuals from beginning in adulthood, so as young as age 18, 50% of the population has at least one chronic disease. Now, mind you, this also includes mental health chronic conditions such as chronic depression or chronic anxiety. So it's not just necessarily the physical health or the physical manifestation of a disease of what you can see, but also these mental health conditions are also considered chronic. Actually, depression and anxiety are what are considered the number one cause for morbidity and for missed work in the United States. So why are they so harmful? Well, they are extremely prevalent, where I mentioned before, 50% of the population over age 18 has at least one. 25% of the population of the adult population has at least two or more chronic diseases. They tend to require a lot. Chronic diseases tend to be pretty costly to treat, and why is that? They require a good bit of long-term treatment. If you remember in Friedman's health impact pyramid, those clinical interventions, they require more clinical visits, which can be expensive, both to the healthcare system and as well to the individual. They require expensive treatments. They require ongoing monitoring of your health. They limit your ability to be productive. They limit the amount of days you can go to work. They reduce some of the activities that you can be able to perform. Not only, again, are they expensive to our economy, they're also pretty expensive to the individual. And when we have talked about health insurance, I think that was the last lecture, you guys, that we kind of went through both the video and the video assignment, as well as my online filmed lecture. You learned that prior to the Affordable Care Act, and even those who kind of fall in the gaps with the Affordable Care Act and still can't get health insurance, people have gone bankrupt and have had diminished qualities of life because they couldn't pay for care, right? Or they couldn't get health insurance on their own. Maybe they were stuck in relationships that had expired, so that had previously expired, or maybe they were stuck in homes or stuck in jobs they didn't want, just so that they could afford health insurance, right? So it definitely impacts your access to care. It definitely impacts your quality of life. And so when we're thinking about these chronic diseases, part of the low-hanging fruit of public health is, if there's this behavioral component, what can we do to prevent them, to keep from these high expenditures, from this lower quality of life, from this long-lasting care that in which we must engage? What can we do? Well, let's look at some of the root causes of chronic disease. I know there's a lot going on here, and this might not be the most academic-looking picture, but I thought it was pretty interesting that it did map out some of the risks for developing chronic disease. We probably already thought about what could lead to obesity, obesity-related chronic diseases, cancer, respiratory-related illnesses. And when you think about it, respiratory-related illness, we know smoking, we know tobacco products have a negative, especially when you're smoking the tobacco from a smokable product that has tar, that coats your lungs. And when we talk about the hazards of smoking, we'll talk about how, again, burning the end of a cigarette or burning the end of a cigar sets the tar on fire, takes it from that physical form that's in cigarette, creates it into a liquid, and that's how you ingest the nicotine. But that tar is what's so incredibly dangerous, and all of the many chemicals that are in those smoking products that are hazardous to your health. We're also thinking of overconsumption of alcohol, right? And even having the amount that is considered quote unquote healthy, a glass of wine a day or one 12-ounce alcoholic beverage a day, does increase your risk for developing breast cancer and a whole host of other cancers. There's the overconsumption of alcohol, which can lead to fatty liver disease and again, can increase your risk for, as it puts stress on your body, especially if you're over consuming, a whole host of stress-related responses and inflammation in your body, which leads to the development of certain chronic diseases. Stress. Stress is a killer. If you remember the Unnatural Causes film, where we talked about the role of cortisol and how it builds up and creates plaque in your bloodways, that can increase your risk for both heart attack as well as stroke. So stress is one of the most negative impacts that you can have on your health. So that's why it's really critical to try to find healthy ways to manage stress, whether it's meditation, whether it's physical activity, whether it's eating a healthy diet, putting yourself on a schedule, and trying to avoid some of those other risk factors such as overconsumption of alcohol or relying on something kind of outside of yourself to deal with that stress. Your diet. Your diet has a huge role on your health. Are you eating a well-balanced diet that's filled with healthy carbohydrates and fats, and that's lower in the unhealthy sugars and the unhealthy fats and excessive amounts of sodium? And if not, what is that setting you up for? What kind of risks are you putting your health in due to an overconsumption of an unhealthy diet? Last but not least, there's exercise, right? Physical activity, which really helps create all kinds of great endorphins, which are great for your mental health. Also boosts your metabolism. It also helps increase the amount of calories that your body's allowed to consume healthfully without putting on excessive weight. So it's great for stress relief. It's good for your physical for just staying healthy. It's good for flexibility. Weight training is pretty critical so that you keep your muscle mass as you get older. It helps to prevent osteoporosis. It helps to prevent to also kind of help you stay flexible as you get older. So all of these are just behaviors or are related to behaviors that people do have some level of control over. That, either done to excess or done minimally can impact your risk for developing chronic diseases. So if we're thinking about, especially in developing countries, we want to know, why has there been such an increase in non-communicable diseases over the years? So first thing I want you to think about is, who's most at risk for developing chronic diseases? Is there a certain age population or a certain demographic you tend to think of more often for who's at risk for developing chronic diseases? And again, what are some of those activities or behaviors that increase your risk for developing non-communicable diseases? I'm going to give you a second to think about it. All right, so literally a second. So next we're going to talk about three particular transitions that have occurred population-wide and also globally that have impacted or increased our risk for developing non-communicable diseases or chronic diseases. First, the demographic transition. By the way, for this upcoming exam as well as for your last exam, understanding these transitions is critical. You're going to be asked, what are the names of them? And you're going to be asked to describe them. So make sure that you understand the meanings behind demographic transition, epidemiological transition, and nutrition transition. And don't just study it to identify it, study it to understand it, right? A lot of public health is about applying information, or at least being able to understand it and describe it. All right, so with this demographic transition, what we're showing here is that over the years, we've started from having high birth rate, but also a high infant mortality rate. So what does that mean? It means less people are living to older ages. Well, when do you often see more chronic diseases? In adulthood, right? And the older you get, the more chronic diseases you see in populations. So at stage one, at the expanding, we saw a high birth rate, but also a high infant mortality rate. And people had shorter lifespans. Why did people have shorter lifespans? What's happened over the years that's increased our longevity? Well, we've had medical discovery, we've had vaccinations, we've had immunizations and vaccinations, we've had enhanced care, we've had screening and early detection for treatment of diseases. We've had more maternal and child health resources that have made birthing healthier. We've had resources to help with hydration, which is dehydration is one of the leading causes, or has been one of the leading causes for infant death. Again, with medical discovery, we've started to see a reduction in infant mortality. So that's what you see in stage 2, is a reduction in infant mortality. People were starting to live a little bit longer, but we also start seeing a reduction in the birth rate. So in stage 3, you see stationary, declining birth rate. And also, sorry, I've got, this is on a timer, so that's oodles of fun, being able to kind of wave your arm and get the lights to turn back on. So in stage 3, you start seeing that as also countries begin to develop more and more, in these more developed countries, you see a lower birth rate. People are living longer. You no longer need to have as many children. Also, there's the invent of family planning resources and distribution of these family planning resources. So there's a lower death rate, there's a lower infant mortality rate, but there's also a lower birth rate. And with the invention of all of these great medications and medical resources, we're seeing that people are living longer. Last but not least, contracting. We have an even lower birth rate, a lower death rate, people are living longer, and that's increasing people's risk for developing chronic disease. So in this next picture, we see an epidemiological transition. So what this shows is that the more developed a country becomes, the less likely that their populations in their country are to die of an infectious disease. The more resources they get, the more that they develop, and the more they're well off economically, the more they start having more of Western health outcomes, such as having chronic diseases and experiencing chronic disease, as opposed to dying from infectious disease. So last but not least, we have the nutrition transition. So I know this looks just super complicated, but this is what I want you to take away from this. Think about how your great-grandparents and their food supply may have differed from your food supply today. If you were thinking of your great-grandparents or your great-great-grandparents, think about what resources you have now that they never would have had in terms of being able to heat food, cook food, freeze food. Before it was called a refrigerator, what people had were these things called ice boxes. And they were literally boxes, and you had this big cube of ice that you would just put into this box, and that's how you would keep your perishable foods from perishing. Well, over time, and with the advent of electricity, modern technology has allowed us to have frozen foods and keep them frozen in the freezer, and we can refrigerate our foods and keep them longer. We've been able to not just have to go from this hunter-gatherer society and just rely off of what we can hunt for the day and what we can harvest for the day, but now we can go to these crazy things called grocery stores and buy those foods instead of spending so much time hunting and gathering our food. And so with some of these foods, we've also needed to create preservatives to be able to keep them longer, right? So what are some of those preservatives? Salt, corn starches, right? High fructose corn syrup. Now, are those the absolute healthiest things for you? No, right? Also, we're starting to eat a diet more full of meat, right? Even the way that our food's being treated is different. Instead of it being this free-range animal that was caught and consumed that day and, distributed to your tribe, you've got these cows and chickens and fish that have been farmed and that have been, well, more so with farm animals, injected with antibiotics So there are all of these new even preservatives that your body's being exposed to that your great-grandparents never had to worry about. So again, with time, just the very way that we've treated our diet has gone from this hunter-gatherer society to a much more processed um, and available food source. So in our next set of slides, we'll talk about preventing and treating chronic disease.